Well, hello there to our listeners. If you're joining us on our feed or the YouTube watchers, if you're joining us via YouTube, this is Josh Burtram, the faithful host, and we're doing another episode of the Faith Roundtable. And we're really excited to have with us today Kevin G. Ford and Jim Singleton. And Kevin Ford is the chief catalyst of Leighton Ford Ministries. He was the co-founder of TAG Consulting, which he and his partners sold in 2019. His books include Transforming Church, The Leadership Triangle, and The Secret Sauce. Kevin's areas of expertise include leadership, organizational culture, and strategy. He has facilitated the development of over 500 strategic plans throughout North America. His clients included Fortune 500, small businesses, and government agencies, but his passion has always been for the church. He has spoken publicly to thousands of people around the world, is in constant demand as a facilitator and speaker. Kevin and his wife, Caroline, live in Charlotte, North Carolina, have 2 daughters. And joining us as well is Jim Singleton. He's a coach, rather, and a discipler at Leighton Ford Ministries. He has been both a longtime Presbyterian pastor in San Antonio, Austin, Spokane, and Colorado Springs, and a professor of pastoral leadership and evangelism at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which I attended for a year. I kind of wish I had kept there, but that's a whole nother story that we'll get into. And Jim is one of the founders of ECO, a Covenant Order of Presbyterians, which sponsors the Flourish Institute of Theology, where Jim also teaches. He and his wife, Sarah, a pastor and spiritual director, live in Spokane, Washington. Guys, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about your newest book, Attentive Church Leadership. Thank you guys for being on the program with us today.
Thanks, Josh. Great to be here.
Yes, I'm super excited. Just seeing the caliber of people that you are. And one of my favorite things about doing this podcasting, my wife will joke with me, you're just doing it so you can talk to people you've always wanted to talk to and just learn from people. And honestly, it's true. I love doing this. I love talking to great minds. It has sharpened me unlike anything else that I've had. But I would love to hear just to start, and we can go with you, Kevin, and then we'll jump to you, Jim. I read your bios there. Those are the bios that I got from IVP, the ones that they sent me. But what am I missing there? Is there anything missing? Kind of what makes you tick and what brought you to this place of writing a book about attentive church leadership?
Thanks, Josh. I think that the bio covered a lot of ground in terms of credentials. It doesn't get to my heart. My heart really is for the renewal of the American church in particular. We also do a lot of work globally with mentoring, raising up the next generation of Christian leaders. So really, Josh, let me tell you a little bit of my background. My father, Leighton Ford, worked for my uncle, Billy Graham, for 30 years. And he left the Graham Association in 1986 because he really had a passion to raise up the next generation of Christian leaders around the world. What he found as he ran different programs and ministries, they brought in well-known speakers, folks like Colin Powell would come teach. What he found is that it was the listening that happened in between the sessions that mattered the most. Listening to the pastors and ministry leaders who were struggling with life. They were struggling in their marriages, they were struggling with personal issues, addiction, and so forth. So this posture of listening really defined my dad's ministry, and that's what attracted me to join with my dad 5 years ago to partner with him at Leighton Ford Ministries. So the book really comes out of that passion of being attentive, listening to ourselves, listening to culture, listening to our congregations, most importantly, listening to God. But it's a posture. So that's how we really arrived at this book.
That's so cool. Jim, what about you?
Well, oddly enough, when I was a pastor in Colorado Springs, I hired Kevin Ford to help us with one of those 500 strategic plans. And in so doing, I was just having certain lack of clarity about where God was calling me. And Kevin said, I think you need to go see my dad. And oddly enough, I had talked to his dad about 30 years before that, 25 years before that, and it was a remarkable conversation, but I hadn't really had one since. So they set it up where I would go spend a couple days, and Leighton actually listened to me and was attentive to me in a way
Wow.
nobody had ever listened, and helped me discern that this was actually the right time to go be a professor at Gordon Conwell, because I had that offer on the table. I was just trying, should I leave what I've been doing? And so it was a combination of Kevin and his father, Leighton, that propelled me. And Leighton had written a book right about that time called The Attentive Life. And it was about paying attention to what God is doing. And most of us get so busy we don't. And so it was that was the genesis for this book, because now I do many of the things Leighton was doing, and that is listening to pastors as a coach. And I think my major job is to help them be attentive to what God is doing in their midst, and even attentive to what God is doing in their own life. So I'm sort of a product of what we're trying to teach.
That is awesome. It's so amazing to hear you guys talk about this, because I don't know if I've ever heard in any of the leadership conferences and all the leadership books that I read throughout seminary and in college, Bible school, and all the books we had to read when I was on staff, and even after starting as a lead pastor of my own church, this kind of emphasis on, hey, let's really listen to the people. I've actually heard people tell me the opposite. You shouldn't listen to your people. They're not going to really tell you what's going on. You really shouldn't, because you kind of need to be the leader and you need to make the decisions. I've always kind of felt like I didn't necessarily like that. And because I felt like if people are involved in your church and they're really, wanting to be a part of this, then they deserve to be listened to and really heard, and their feedback deserves to be kind of taken and absorbed into your conscience and absorbed into your thinking. And I would love to hear from you guys. And we can start with Jim. We'll start with you and then jump to you, Kevin. How does Attentive Church Leadership, how does it redefine the role of a church leader in fostering kind of this culture of deep listening engagement with their congregation, staff, the key stakeholders that they have?
Well, let me just start with the context. We use a passage from Joshua 3 where Joshua is about to cross over the Jordan, and God says to him, you're going to have to follow the ark because you have never been this way before. And I find most church leaders today are actually leading in a place where most of them have never been before. That means we have seen the demise of Christendom on our watch. We have kind of unhitched the truck from a cultural support for the faith. There are lots of issues that are swirling around which we cannot seem to agree. Your very podcast, and the political issues that charge the church. We've had some complicated eras before in that, but nothing quite like this one. So if we're in a place we've never been before, then why would we assume that me, the individual leader, knows exactly where to go? What we're hearing from Joshua is you're going to have to follow the ark. And so we think with Attentive Church Leadership, we're trying to help people follow where the Spirit is leading. And part of that is coming to greater grips with who we are. Self-awareness is not something that is a remarkable feature for most American pastors. We are lower on self-awareness than the population in general. I've just spent 12 years teaching seminary students. They are not remarkable in self-awareness. So why would you follow a deceived self-awareness? One of Calvin's favorite verses was Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things. Who can understand it? So if that's your heart, why would you trust it? You're going to need to have, as the Proverbs say, in the abundance of counselors, there is much wisdom. That means I'm going to have to listen to them. And so being attentive to God, the leading of the Spirit, being attentive to your people, being attentive to what Kevin will so aptly describe as the DNA, the true north of our church, and rediscovering who are these people? Because this church in this location is not the same thing as the one I pastored previously. So how do we understand that? So it's that kind of attentiveness that is at the core of this approach.
Yeah, Kevin, what would you say?
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. So, Josh, you're from the DC area. I lived there for
Yes.
15 years, and two of my favorite sports writers were with the Washington Post, Michael Wilbon and Tony Kornheiser, and they do Pardon the Interruption now
Right.
on ESPN. It was
That's
fascinating
awesome.
listening to them recently talk about Dabu Sweeney from Clemson, who has not
Mm.
brought in a single transfer player this year, not a single one.
Wow.
He's refused
Wow.
to adapt his coaching style to the changes that have happened in college sports. So the transfer portal, the name, image, likeness, payment issue, and so forth. He is refusing to adapt, and we're seeing what's happening with the Clemson program as they went from a national champion down to 9-4 this past year. Contrast that with someone like Scott Drew, the basketball coach at Baylor, who's been on the cutting edge of adapting his own coaching philosophy to the changes that have happened in college sports. He was one of the first ones to
Mm.
pick people up through the transfer portal and other international players and so forth. That's a great analogy for what's happening in the church. We have pastors who refuse to adapt, who refuse to listen, who refuse to change, and we have some who are making great strides. Uh, I'm not a huge fan, just to go back to your first point about listening to the congregation. I'm not a huge fan of saying, let's give all the decisions to the congregation. There's a difference
Sure.
between abdicating leadership and listening. So we had Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, speak to a group of our client CEOs when I was in business. And by the way, he charged $90,000 for one day, and he was worth every penny. He was phenomenal. But he said,
There you go.
the reason that we listen is not to gain consensus on the front end. He said we listen to gather information so that we know what the roadblocks are, we know what the pushback's going to be, we know where the resistance will be, so that we can make a better informed decision. Consensus only comes after the fact, after we make a good decision, often dealing with competing values. So we listen to the congregation because that helps us to understand what the competing values are. Your very podcast is about competing values. You have the right wing and
Yes.
the left wing. It's how do we navigate that? That's what we call an adaptive issue. So we listen to understand so we can make better decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the things that I've tried to do is I've tried to walk, even recently in my church, through a decision-making process where we're trying to hear from each other and we're trying to hear from God. So we're not a large church, we're a small church. We met in my house. We tried a house church model for 4 years. We're now adding to that and needing to move out of the house and expand. And so we're doing it, but we're facing this decision where we have, two locations that we're trying to look at. And one of them is probably better in some sense for, invitability in terms of the people in my immediate area, although there's other people in the church that are not here in my immediate area. And the other one is better cost wise. There's a significant cost savings. And then there's especially, in terms of its facilities, it's much better in terms of matching, what we need right now. And I'm trying to walk them through this. And then on top of that, I have, the competing values, like you just mentioned, Kevin, about the different things that people feel and want, the diversity racially, the diversity in terms, even the sexual orientation diversity that we're facing, even in such a small church where there's a lot of questions and wondering and the younger generation about certain about gender issues, about what's the big deal, and with gender roles. And I don't want to get into all that too much, but what I'm trying to paint is I'm trying to paint this picture of, even in this small congregation that I have, it's almost bewildering the different ideas and the different thoughts and the different processes that I'm even having to deal with when I have even such a small, and then imagining, of course, as we're scaling up, and if you're aiming for a diverse church, then you're going to face even more of these things. And I'm just wondering, what kind of challenges are you guys seeing that contemporary church leaders are facing that really need to be overcome by the principles that you're showing and describing and recommending that people espouse in attentive church leadership? Kevin, what do you think? And then we'll
Yeah, I think, Josh, as you describe your situation, which is a fairly typical situation for many churches, making decisions of some sort, the
yes.
first step is listening, because when you listen, people will feel valued. At the end of the day, whatever decision you make, you can at least say you did your best to listen and to value people and to give them a sense of ownership in the decision itself. The second thing, though, I think is it's part of the task of leadership is to clarify the true north. So we talk about the four areas of true north. The Greek word, really the closest English word is identity or essence. Who are we as a church? Clarifying what we value most. What are those 3, 4, 5 things that really tell us what we will bet the farm on? The second thing is our mission, our apostolos. What are we trying to accomplish? What do we do and what do we not do? Michael Porter from Harvard says that a good mission statement tells us what we don't do. And we find that most church mission statements are so broad that they don't answer any questions. They're just a recapitulation maybe of the Great Commission or the Great Commandment. So what really is our mission, our particular unique niche in the kingdom to help advance the kingdom? The third piece of True North is our vision, our telos, the end result. What are we actually trying to accomplish? If mission is what we do, vision is where we're heading, and then strategy, which comes from the Greek strategos, is how do we get there? What are the ways that we're going to marshal our resources? So the question about facilities, location, really falls in line with that fourth dimension of strategy. But you have to have the other three clear first. So that when you make a decision, you're able to tell your congregation the why behind the decision. The why is your values, your mission, your vision, before you get to strategy. So many leaders will start with a tactical decision. Let's move here because it's cheaper. Let's stay in the home because it's less money. Rather than saying, we need to make the right decision, not the most expedient decision. The expedient decisions, in some ways, they become tomorrow's problems. Today's solution becomes tomorrow's problem, especially when we're making expedient decisions. Jim, how would you respond to that?
I'd just respond. I think Josh needs you to come in as a consultant for a little while and help him with this decision.
I don't know if I can afford the $90,000 for one day.
He's only $89,000. He's cheap. He's cheap.
That's cheap. Yeah.
No, I would. That's a big part of this book, Josh, is helping people understand those four little Greek words, what they mean, and when you don't know the answer to that, and see, probably when you're beginning a new church like you are, which is now probably 4 or 5 years old, that identity question, which is filled with values, has probably a little bit elusive because you started it, and so it's very wed to your identity, but now you've got a group of people who may not see everything the way you see it. So do we know what that first step is? Because when you start making strategic decisions without knowing that identity and values and the mission and the vision, then as Kevin said, you're just setting up a different set of problems tomorrow, because then you're going to have to kind of undo and refine that vision and identity to accommodate now this new space we're in, which is the tail wagging the dog. You really want the other thing to come first. So that's just a great example of the kind of work Kevin does so much of.
That's so good. I mean, I feel good. Like, I feel like the mission, so our mission is making building Christ-centered communities one person at a time. And we've talked about that a lot. We've really pushed on that a lot. Like, every person matters. We want every person to be discipled and to feel like they matter in this process, and yet we want them to be, part of community. None of it is, revolutionary, but I'm not necessarily going for revolutionary. But I feel like we've done that, but I feel like the values, I haven't done a good job of talking about the values of what we really, I think I've tried to live them, but I don't think I've done a very good job of really teaching them. And it is difficult because Kevin, you mentioned the tactical decisions, right? And it just feels like all you face sometimes as a pastor or a ministry leader is tactical decisions. You have to make decisions about budget. You have to make decisions about location. You have to make decisions about all these different areas where, and because people, that's what you feel like. And this is just speaking personally from just my own personal experience. You feel like that's what people care about. They care about results, right? They want to see results. They want to see growth. They want to see budget increase. They want to see, the right location. That's what they want to see, the results. They want to see the lag measures. But it's like, and so you spend all your time worrying and thinking about that, and yet those lag measures aren't gonna. They don't. That's exactly what they are, right? They're just they're results of other decisions that are made. And so I'd love for you to walk through and you started it, but even go into greater depth on what kind of principles are outlined that you guys feel like that you've outlined in the book. And you can even move into your personal, if there's things outside of the book that you would want to talk about that help people balance administrative, tactical decisions with the kind of, maybe more important spiritual, emotional needs of their community that they're ministering to. We can start with you, Kevin. We'll jump to you, Jim.
Yeah, so every church really has, if you think of the church as the intersection of three circles, we have a church as a faith community, we have church as family, and we have church as business. And there's going to be an intersection of those three circles. Church as faith community, we expect to reach people for Christ. We expect people to grow as disciples. Church as family, we have weddings, we have funerals, we have potlucks. Church as business, we have to pay salaries. And it's often a challenge to know which hat we're wearing because of those roles. And so in the book, we talk about three different types of leadership. And I think this is maybe a useful tool. We talk about tactical leadership, strategic leadership, and transformational leadership. So tactical leadership is what most pastors are trained to do. So for a pastor, that includes preaching and teaching, pastoral care, hospital visitation, paying bills, running board meetings, and so forth. We do a lot of work with church boards, and most church boards, I would say their agendas are 100% tactical most of the time. All they deal with is tactical issues. Did we meet budget? Are we meeting these results, and so forth? So the strategic part of leadership is looking at the changing context around us and saying, how do we adapt? This goes back to the Davos Sweeney, the world around us is changing, but I haven't changed my strategy. So how is the world around us changing? Transformational leadership deals with the unexpected. It deals with the crisis, the conflict, the scandal, the things that happen virtually in every church that require a different type of leadership. So think of a transformational leader as someone who's more like a grief counselor, dealing with people who have experienced loss. A strategic leader, a strategic pastor, someone who's casting a vision, listening to people. Tactical leadership is where we're getting things done. And you have to get things done. That creates trust. If we don't ever get things done, if we don't exercise tactical leadership, then we don't have any trust. People won't believe us. So let me tell you just a quick story that may resonate with Josh, with you. We worked with a church in Moultrie, Georgia, a number of years ago. It's a church plant. They were meeting in a warehouse, and they were very clear on their mission. Every member in ministry, that was their mission. What they weren't clear on was their values. So they were bursting at the seams. The pastor called me. He said, "Hey, we're overflowing on Sunday morning. We've got 100 acres here, meeting in this worn down warehouse. We've hired an architect. The architect has designed a beautiful red brick sanctuary that looks like every prototypical Southern church." And he said, "It doesn't feel right. It's going to cost us about $4 million, and I don't know what it is." So we went in there, our team went in there, and we did focus groups and surveys and so forth. And what we heard as we listened was that it was the building that actually attracted people to the church. And we were startled at first. What was it about the building? It's an ugly warehouse. It's worn down. It's run down. It doesn't work very well.
Right.
And they said it communicates a value. And that value is we value ministry over programs. We value ministry. We value people over buildings. And so we had one retreat.
Yes.
It did not cost $90,000. And we decided to fire the architect. They hired a new architect who came in and built a bigger warehouse that seated about 2,500 people. The very first Sunday, in their new sanctuary, the new warehouse. It was a nice warehouse, but it wasn't a spectacular red brick sanctuary. The very first Sunday, They had people reading the scripture 24/7 through their new PA system, and they were praying. And the last prayer, as people walked in, was prayed by a teenage boy with Down syndrome.
Wow.
And the pastor said there was not a dry eye in the place. People walked in and they experienced every member in ministry in this new, bigger warehouse. So it was a process of listening to the surrounding community, listening to the congregation, and making decisions that resulted in something that was really in line with their DNA, that felt right to them. So teenage boy, Down syndrome, praying as people walked in for their very first service in the new warehouse. It was spectacular.
That's amazing. Jim, what do you think?
The only thing I would add is that when we are unclear about values, I sense that they are often like invisible walls, and you just keep bumping into them and banging your nose and going, "What was that? Where did that come from? Why are we doing it that way?" And so taking the time to seek clarity, who really are we, eliminates a lot of broken noses. And you can just move a little faster. And that's really what Kevin was illustrating. And I might just want to put in a plug for, kind of one of Kevin's old books called The Leadership Triangle, where all three of those different types of leaderships are differentiated. We've got them in this book as well, but that gives you a broader take, because most pastors just have never heard of those three different types of leadership, and that they function very differently. And you just really have to put in the clutch, shift gears, and suddenly not become the tactical expert that you were. Now you're really listening to loss and listening to people process change. And that's a very different role. And again, without self-awareness, most pastors don't know how to make that shift.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kevin, did you have something that was on the tip of your tongue there?
I just wanted to...
I saw you.
When we think of values, people get very confused. They think of what we want to become. That's not what our values are. Values are who we actually are, who God has made us to be, who God has designed us to be. So we encourage churches to go through a process of listening to stories, telling stories. What attracted you to this church? What are the meaningful memories here? What are the key decisions this church has made that have been important decisions? Who are the unsung heroes? So you start getting those stories, and you start hearing words and phrases that are repeated over and over and over, and that begins to clarify what those existing values are. So aspired values are really our future strategies, but your arete is your identity. That's who you really are. That comes by listening to the stories, and then really arriving at choices of words that are unique to your congregation. So we worked with a church out in Washington State, and they could have said that one of their core values was outreach or evangelism or missions. But theirs was very clearly unselfishly serving those who will never sit in our pews. That's a lot more clear than outreach.
Yes.
We encourage churches to be as clear as possible to clarify that identity. That will attract people to the mission, to the values, and then they will be on board with decisions that are made in the future.
How do you communicate the values? Like once you've understood what they are, and once you've understood, gone through this process, what would you say to the pastor who has done that, and then now, hey, I need to communicate these, or do I just leave them? That's what we are, so people are just gonna know that, or we have to articulate them, put them out there. Is it about how do you communicate it in a way that is compelling and effective?
Yeah, you communicate it over and over and over in every medium possible. You plaster them throughout the building. You put them on your website. You put them on your bulletin if you still use a bulletin. You tell stories on Sunday morning that align with the values. You do a sermon series on them. You emphasize them over and over and over. We have a church out in the Tucson area that we talk about in the book, Desert Hills Church in Green Valley, Arizona. They literally have the values carved in stone in their parking lot as
Wow.
you drive through the parking lot. And they emphasize them over and over and over. So there's a sense of this is who we are. It brings us together. It creates, to borrow a business term, it creates a sense of what we call brand community. So brand community is where we come together around a particular brand. So I'm a North Carolina Tar Heel. When I walk through an airport, I'm wearing my North Carolina Tar Heel shirt. We fist bump each other.
Yes.
We have a sense that we're on the, we all went to Carolina. We're part of this brand community. Harley owner groups are brand community. There's a sense of identity.
Yes.
So the core values are really the primary thing that create that sense of togetherness. And it comes out of our own stories, which is what binds us together.
That's amazing. I love that idea. I'll throw this to you, Jim, and then Kevin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So you have the values that you already know you have. You communicate them, make sure you communicate them. Basically what I'm hearing is in every possible avenue that makes sense to do so. You're trying to make sure that people understand those right from day one, kind of thing. What do you do with aspirational values, right? You mentioned evangelism. People throw these values out there that we have evangelism, or, we're people of prayer or something like that, but maybe they're not people of prayer. Maybe they want to be people of prayer, but they don't pray that much, right? Or whatever it is. How does it go from your actual values to your aspirational values? And then with these aspirational values, what happens when they become actual values? And then do you carve another, place in a parking lot? I'm not trying to be silly about it, but I'm just wondering, how do you work through that process?
Well, values are often not known. So that would be issue number one. And coming to do the listening to uncover it's really archaeological work, Josh. It's excavating what is there. So one of the examples I use in the book, Kevin came to this church in Colorado Springs, and we were trying to discern whether to start a new denomination. And I remember the meeting, one of the elders asked, now, who is already in this swimming pool of this new denomination? I said, well, nobody's in the swimming pool. In fact, we don't even have water in the swimming pool. We would have to jump in with no water. And they said, we're just not the kind of church that takes risks. And Kevin happened to be there, and he piped up, Now, that's not what I've heard as you've told the story, because were you the first congregation in Colorado Springs to start divorce recovery workshop? Well, yeah, actually we were. And didn't you get criticism for that? Yeah, because it looked like we were baptizing divorce. We were not. We're just taking care of people. Well, that was a risk. I guess it was. Were you the first church to ordain a woman? Well, yeah, we were. Did you lose a Sunday school class over that? Well, yeah, we actually did. And was that not a risk? Yeah, I guess it was. Did you start grief recovery workshop? So he had already heard all these stories, and he just kind of held the mirror up and said, is this you? Is this you? And It was that moment when they go, well, I guess if we are a risk-taking congregation, maybe we ought to be doing this. But they didn't even see it, Josh. until somebody had mined or excavated those stories to discover who they actually were. So it's not an easy task to understand the values of who we actually are and even affirm those. And in a place like you're working in, which is a new congregation, those are probably rather fluid. They're probably floating around in your mind and heart. And you have leaked them onto people, but you really don't know whether they've gotten it or not until you ask the stories. Now, we all have some aspirational values of things we're trying to grow into, but that's not really functioning as a filter right now for what we're doing, because that's still out there. We want to become that. And so, yes, you would revise your list of values at some point if that became reality. But you're just now testing what is reality. And that's a fairly complicated, but such a necessary process. So I'll let Kevin jump in.
Yeah, I think when it comes to aspirational values, they can become values. We hope they actually do become values over time. We've worked with a number of churches who have changed and updated their values. One church in Charleston we worked with had a history of foreign missions that was very important to them. They gave a lot of money to missions. 6 years later, they changed their missions value to being missional because they had become much more local in equipping and discipling their members to live out the gospel in their neighborhoods and their workplaces. So it was the same swimming pool, to borrow Jim's metaphor, but it had changed from missions, foreign missions, to being missional. We see that kind of thing happen quite a bit. How you get there, this is where we think of the true north needing alignment, needing constant and continual realignment. So things like facilities, stewardship programs, leadership, recruiting and leadership development, public relations and branding facilities, all that kind of stuff has to continually be realigned, including staffing. So as we think about future priorities, whether you call them aspirational values or strategies or strategic priorities or objectives, they need to have reinforcements. And the reinforcements come from staff or volunteers or budget so that we get there. We say that it's important to us in the future, so we're going to put resources behind it now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what I'm hearing, just to make sure I'm understanding it, it's like you have to start where you are, right? And get a sense of what's reality. Because you might have, we have a list of 10 values, right? That we've written out that we feel like
That's
we
too
want.
many.
But then the question is, that's too many.
Yeah.
So what does it need to be, like 3?
4 or 5
4?
is good. Yeah, we worked with a church in
4 or
Philadelphia
5.
that had 28 core values, and each one cancels the other out.
Well, hey, at least I'm doing better than that.
Yeah.
So I got to divide by 2. That's all right. We can figure that one out. But I hear what you're saying, because it's like, yeah, how much of these are we actually even really living out? And then what's like looking at this and seeing the reality, like what is not on there that really should be on there, because that's what we're doing. Right. So it's like doing that, having an aspiration, and then reevaluating, like putting that aspiration into some kind of concrete, behavior that the church does and puts resources behind, volunteer, budget, all of that, right? And pastoral staffing behind. And then evaluating in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. Like what would you guys say? Is that the right process that I'm thinking of and what am I missing in that?
Yeah, I think it's an iterative process. The overall big picture true north is something that needs to be revisited probably every 2 or 3 years, especially as you have new leaders who rotate in and rotate out, depending on how you do your leadership. But it needs to be something that they are engaged in. So every time there's a new group of leaders, they should be involved in re-evaluating your values, mission, vision, and strategy. In terms of updating, we encourage the church board to at least look at strategic priorities every month, maybe every quarter, but it needs to be front and center.
Wow.
Otherwise, you get the tyranny of the urgent takes over, and you focus too much on the tactical stuff.
That makes sense. Jim, what would you add?
Well, I think, Josh, if you just, I find it helpful to ask two questions. What brought you to this church? And what has kept you at this church?
Wow.
And if you ask 20 people in your congregation those two questions and discovered that they all related to your 10 values that now are going to become 5, then you go, okay, we've got some alignment. If the things that brought them and kept them really are something other than your values, then you realize, okay, these may not be as persuasive to the rest of folks as I thought. And so it's just that's another excavation kind of job that just allows you to reflect on, is what we say we value really actually what we value? Because I'm finding in lots of congregations, those are not the same.
Yeah, I absolutely imagine that that's the case. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think in every church that I've ever been,
Right.
there has been that sense of
That's right.
here's what we're saying we value, but then here's what people are experiencing when they come here.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine that kind of alignment brings such a momentum and synergy with it that I'm getting excited just thinking about the prospects
It's
of
like chiropractor, Josh. Your neck has a little crick in it, and you just need it aligned.
I do kind of feel like
And
my stomach.
yeah, and that happens on the soul level. That's what I call Kevin's father,
Yes.
Leighton. He is the chiropractor of my soul. But it happens on the
Nice.
institutional level too. And that's where Kevin is the chiropractor. And he kind of comes in and yanks your neck around, and you go, I feel better. Feel worse initially, but then I feel better. And then I come in and coach you and pat you up after that.
What's your response to that? And then I have one last question for you guys.
Yeah, I think one of the things we talked about in the book is that process in some ways is more important than content. I remember talking with a guy, a British evangelist and pastor years ago, who took 15 years to revitalize a church in London. And he worked with his leadership team. Lots of errors, lots of mistakes along the way, but they were persistent. And after 15 years, the church had revitalized. He wrote a book about it, and it was a theological description of the end result. He thought it would do really well in the United States, and the book failed miserably. And he said, I guess it just didn't work in the United States. No, Mike, it wasn't that. It was the 15 years of process that brought about the revitalization. It wasn't the content. It wasn't the book you wrote. So process really is the secret sauce that makes these things happen, where people feel listened to and engaged. So the words might change every couple of years. If you carve your values in stone, be prepared to excavate them, dig them up, and replace them. Might be expensive, but it's worth it. So it's an ongoing process that creates that level of engagement.
I love that. Here's my last major question. That I have a small tactical question at the end about how people can keep up with what you guys are doing. But we'll start with you, Jim. Jump to Kevin. What is the impact that you're hoping and praying that Attentive Church Leadership has for the church world, for church leaders, and potentially even broader?
I think Kevin and I are both very longing for renewal, and seasons of renewal and seasons of God's movement of his Spirit. So that would be the kind of big end product. And we think it starts with leaders becoming more attentive and helping their leaders become more attentive. But I think the end impact of that is we would just love to see a season of renewal, because we're pretty confused as a church in North America right now.
Yes. Kevin, what would you say?
I would just add to that my personal passion is to see renewal, not just in the church, but in the local neighborhood, the local community of the church. We're partnering right now with Church United in South Florida, about 500 churches in Fort Lauderdale, Miami, in that area, to bring about renewal in the neighborhoods. Especially, Josh, with your podcast, we see such a divided country. We're seeing a divided church. We see churches partnering together, cooperating, collaborating to bring about renewal in their own neighborhoods. That means the scorecard has to change. It's not about how many people are coming on
Mm,
Sunday morning. We've got a church in Illinois. Their scorecard is the divorce rate in their county. Are we making a
wow.
difference in the divorce rate in our county? It's the highest divorce rate per capita in the United States. So that's become their scorecard.
Wow, that is amazing. That's super inspiring too. This is last tactical question, practical one. Jim, how can people follow you, keep up with your work, and what else is in the pipe for you?
Well, I
And then
think
we'll jump to you, Kevin.
I think going to the Leighton Ford Ministries website is a great way to keep up with both of us and see the work there. And I think the next thing on my plate is a book that's I hope will be called Attentive Church Discipleship, because again, it's been a big programmatic hope, but we really have not pulled this off in North America very well. Our people are
Yeah.
not discipled, and so tinkering with a bunch of projects through Leighton Ford Ministries, working in a lot of local churches, trying to learn from their attempts. And so I hope, maybe in 2 years that will be the next book that has Attentive in it.
In 2 years, I'll be reaching out to have you on the podcast to talk
Great.
about that book. Kevin, what about you? How can people follow and what's next
Yeah,
for you?
our website, LFM, as in Leighton Ford Ministries, lfmconnect.org, is where we have all of our resources, videos, articles, and so forth. And we also have a podcast. It's the Attentive Church Leadership podcast that's out there monthly for pastors and ministry leaders to go through these very topics. So that's the best way to follow us.
That's awesome. Of course, they can pick up your book anywhere books
Anywhere
are
books are
Attentive
sold.
Church Leadership.
Yeah, Amazon's the best just because that creates more momentum and more energy for the book. But wherever books are sold.
That's great. And we'll absolutely put a link to that. We encourage people to pick up the book and read it. Of course, for any of our pastors that are listening, to check out Leighton Ford Ministries. Guys, I can't thank you enough for coming on the program
Thank you.
today. It has been a delight to speak with you. Really appreciate it. God bless you guys.
Thanks, Josh. God bless you.
Absolutely. And to our viewers and listeners, thanks for joining. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless you guys. We'll see you on the flip side.